Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for a special summertime episode of School Psych Podcast. Really, really excited for this episode. We have a guest on who is we've had multiple other guests talk very positively about, and that a lot of his papers are required reading in their courses that they teach in their school psychology program. So really great topic, and I'm just excited. But I'm Rachel. I'm a school psychologist working in the state of Maryland, and I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca. Rebecca?
Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca, a school psychologist working in the state of Connecticut. And I want to remind those of you that are watching live how to participate. If you're watching the video right now, you can comment right on the side by signing into your YouTube account. We'll be looking for comments there. And if you are watching either recorded or live but without the video, you can comment on School Psych podcast page on Facebook. Put your comment anywhere in messages or right on the page, School Psych, your school psychologist page, also on Facebook and on Twitter using the hashtag #PsychedPodcast, which you should see right under my name if you're watching. We're looking for comments and questions and anything that you'd like to add to the discussion. And here is Eric.
Hi, everybody. I'm Eric, also a school psychologist working in Connecticut. And it's my pleasure today to sub for Anna, as well as introduce Dr. Scott Lilienfeld. We're excited for this conversation because pseudoscience is something that certainly affects all of us, and best practices and busting myths in our field is certainly incredibly important. So Dr. Lilienfeld is a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at Emory University in Atlanta. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from Cornell University and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. His principal areas of research are personality disorders, psychiatric classification and diagnosis, evidence-based practices in psychology, and the challenges posed by pseudoscience in clinical psychology. Dr. Lilienfeld received the 1998 David Shakow Award for early career contributions to clinical psychology. He's a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and is past president of the Society for a Science of Clinical Psychology. He's the co-author of Science and Pseudoscience in Clinical Psychology and Psychology, From Inquiry to Understanding. So we're excited to speak with you today, Dr. Lilienfeld, and wondering if we could start with perhaps you giving us an overview about what pseudoscience looks like to you, and perhaps how you're envisioning what you've been sharing and talking about in this part of the field.
Yeah, thanks so much. I probably should say up front that my degree's in clinical psychology. I'm not technically a clinical psychologist because I'm not licensed, although I'm actually going to try to get back into doing clinical practice pretty soon. I do kind of miss it. And I sometimes feel as researchers we're kind of stuck a little bit in our little ivory towers, and I'm trying slowly but surely to kind of get out of that a little bit. So a lot of my thinking over the last 20 years increasingly has moved to how to think scientifically about our field and our subject matter. And the topic of pseudoscience has always been a big interest of mine, and I think it's one important vehicle for how to think about thinking, actually. So pseudoscience we can sort of conceptualize as a set of disciplines that looks scientific but is not actually scientific. It can fool all of us, and I do think we probably need a better term for it. I haven't been able to come up with one. Maybe one of our listeners or viewers will be able to. I think it's a bit pejorative, but I think it's an important concept regardless of the term, because again, pseudosciences are things that look as though they're playing by the rules of science, but they're not actually playing by those rules. And the way we think about it is that pseudoscience, in contrast to sciences, tend to lack certain safeguards against bias. So there are lots of safeguards against things like confirmation bias, for example. In particular, confirmation bias being a very deep-seated tendency that we're all kind of prone to seek out evidence consistent with what we believe, consistent with our hypotheses, and deny, dismiss, distort evidence that's not. In general, pseudoscientists tend to lack the safeguards against sciences that we see in other disciplines. Although I should say the boundaries between science and pseudoscience are pretty fuzzy. Sciences sometimes fall prey to a lot of these mistakes too, a lot of these errors. So it's not anything unique to pseudoscience, but in pseudosciences we tend to see a frequent absence of those kinds of safeguards against error and bias in particular.
And I know that, like you said, it's kind of a gray area, and we see there's been a lot crossing my news feed and that I've been reading about with replication crisis, and that some of these classic experiments that we're seeing are not maybe holding up the test of time or not being replicated. And so you have to wonder, where is that line? What is good science? It's hard to.
That's right. Well, we've come to realize the hard way that even academic researchers have been prone to engaging in practices that may inflate the probability of false results and may increase the likelihood their hypotheses are going to get corroborated, even though those hypotheses are false. And the replication crisis has in some ways been some tough soul searching for a lot of us, myself included, because I think we've come to realize that a lot of the practices that we ourselves thought were just kind of mainstream and correct were not necessarily so good. And that those practices, and I can talk more about those, but may have in some ways contributed to the difficulty we're having in replicating findings. So we're realizing that yes, science is obviously a very important set of bulwarks against error, but we're not immune from those kinds of errors ourselves either. So we shouldn't be too high and mighty.
And so I also wanted to ask too, just because I myself, sometimes I get into arguments on Facebook with people who post things, and I know Rebecca's been fending off some people. How do you, if you're kind of if you have a level of skepticism and you want to make sure that you're practicing appropriately and you're using good scientific practices and you're up to date on the research, but there's kind of a line too of you want to be open to new things and not closed-minded. And sometimes I find myself commenting on Facebook groups or forums and things like that. And I think that I sometimes come off as like a snarky, there's no research behind that. And I kind of anger people. Yeah. Is there a line? How can you be kind of skeptical of this stuff and also be open-minded and not a jerk?
I would raise that, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that. It's something I've struggled with for like the last 20 years, and I wouldn't say I ever get quite right. But I think that it's important to recognize that there is a continuum between extreme open-mindedness, where you let everything in, and on one extreme, and cynicism on the other hand, which is extreme closed-mindedness, where you let nothing in. Skepticism, which has kind of gotten a bad name, I think, in many quarters, really just means open-minded inquiry. So ultimately, we all want to be skeptics. A skeptic should be open-minded, but insist on evidence. And it's really that middle ground we're always trying to find. I think exactly where we occupy that middle ground is going to be a matter of debate. But if we get so close-minded that we reject any claim that seems a priori implausible, then we're not being very scientific ourselves. And I think, to be honest with you, I think early in my career when I first started doing this, I was probably guilty of that mistake myself. I'll tell you one thing I've come to realize is that sometimes one maybe can't always change people's minds, and that shouldn't always be the goal, whether it's in science or politics. And we also live in a very politically polarized environment, and I think sometimes we all, or many of us, make the mistake of trying to change people's minds on the other side. I'm not sure how useful that is. I think it may be more helpful, as the late Eli Schnur pointed out in an article, to plant a seed of doubt. I think sometimes planting a seed of doubt can be actually the more important goal. So rather than someone's using a clinical practice, school psychology practice, for example, that we don't think is very well grounded, I think it's perfectly appropriate to point that out. But I think doing it, first of all, respectfully is very crucial. And also realizing that maybe the goal shouldn't be to change their minds, but instead to make them realize, well, maybe there's another side here. So even just encouraging the person to say, well, is it possible you might be mistaken about this? What is some evidence that might make you change your mind? What's some evidence that might convince you otherwise? Let's have an open conversation about it. That I have found over the years, it's not perfect, but I found over the years that's often a more helpful strategy to invite the person to engage in a collaborative conversation. And sometimes, again, not even changing the person's mind, but also, or instead, making the person less confident of their beliefs is in some ways just as important, if not more important.
Yeah, those are really interesting points, and I think that I like your idea of kind of that spectrum of flexibility in dialoguing with each other. I wonder, along that line, are there some sort of levels of demarcation of science and pseudoscience that you would say must be met before we can even entertain ideas? Are there a couple of things, like, it must, if it's in order to be a science, it must be able to be falsified with evidence? Or I remember from a long time ago in my study of philosophy, the philosophers of science had some really delineated ideas of how we can tell the difference. And it's not just peer-reviewed journals, and because even astrologers have peer-reviewed journals. Do you have some points where you think these are these are categories or ways to mark the difference?
I do, to some degree. Yeah, I think you posed it really well. And this goes back to what Sir Karl Popper, the Austrian philosopher of science, termed the demarcation problem. So he was interested in the question of how do we demarcate, distinguish science from pseudoscience. And Popper, you mentioned falsifiability. Popper thought that was really the core thing distinguishing science from pseudoscience, that scientific claims could in principle be shown to be wrong, could in principle be refuted. Pseudoscientific claims couldn't. The demarcation problem, not to get too technical, but that's kind of had a somewhat negative history in philosophy, because there have been a number of other philosophers like Larry Lavin who basically said, give it up. It's not even worth it. There's no way of demarcating science from pseudoscience because things are kind of fuzzy, and the field for a while moved away from that. Now I think we're beginning to come back to a middle ground, which is one I occupy, where people realize maybe there's not a single criterion, maybe there's not a strict criterion distinguishing science from pseudoscience like falsifiability, but there may be a number of warning signs, things to look out for that may help you think about whether something is more likely to be pseudoscientific, more likely to be something you might want to accord greater skepticism to. And that's sort of my view. So there are a number of them that have been delineated by other authors. We've kind of followed in some of the same footsteps. So I think falsifiability is one of them. One question I would pose in many cases is the claim something that really could be disproven? So to give a controversial one that I'm writing about right now, I would argue, and this may or may not be as relevant to school psychology, but it's relevant to psychology at large, is the so-called brain disease model of addiction. And there's no doubt that addiction is partly mediated by the brain, it has to be, but the model itself sometimes is so vague it's hard to even know what would be evidence that would disprove the idea that addiction is a brain disease. So that's a big problem with that model and many others, is it may not be a claim that one could actually show to be wrong. Do the proponents of the discipline make exaggerated claims that go way beyond the evidence? The late Carl Sagan famously said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you're going to make an extreme claim that goes way beyond what we already know, it could be right, and we should be open to it. We should dismiss it too quickly, but that should be met by equally convincing evidence. Over-reliance on anecdotes and testimonial evidence is another, I think, warning sign. Again, it doesn't mean it's always a fatal sign, but anecdotes, by the way, can be helpful in the initial phases of generating hypotheses. So if someone says, I've used this technique, I've used this brain training technique, or I've tried these techniques and so on, they seem to have some promise, we should listen to that. We shouldn't ignore it entirely, but by the same token, we don't want to rely exclusively on anecdotes and testimonial kinds of evidence. Avoidance of peer review is another one you mentioned. Peer review is by no means a perfect safeguard. I'm a journal editor myself, and I can attest to the fact it ain't perfect. Reviewers can be pig-headed and biased, and sometimes reject manuscripts that go against their beliefs, and sometimes they accept and they could be quite good manuscripts, but they don't jive with their preconceptions. They could be prone to confirmation biases too. Sometimes they might accept not very good manuscripts because they fit with their biases, but still peer review is one helpful safeguard against error. So there are a number of others, but those are some of the key warning signs I would look out for. Again, I don't think any single one of those is necessarily fatal, but the more of those you begin to see, the more suspicious you might want to become about a claim.
Yeah. So you mentioned those brain training programs, and you mentioned the brain model of addiction. What are your sort of top 5 favorite pseudosciences?
2 hours for that one. I don't know. That's a tough one. I don't have a top 5, but I can tell you one way of answering this is that may be relevant to school psychology. We've been very interested in myths and misconceptions, and there's a bit of a difference there between pseudoscience, but there's a host of myths and misconceptions that kind of give rise to pseudoscientific practices. So, for example, the idea that most people use only 10% of their brain power is amazingly prevalent. In some surveys, it's maybe 60% of the general public believe that. The evidence against that claim is overwhelming. The claim that there are certain people that are just left-brained, other people are just right-brained is another very common one that you see. The idea that there are more, another one we get a lot is, are there more weird things that happen during full moons? There are meta-analysis, quantitative reviews that show that there's no evidence for that at all, yet surveys show that lots of people, including, by the way, ER doctors and nurses, often fall prey to that belief. So those are some other common ones. Another, I think, one that's more serious that I think has important implications for those psychologists who work at the interface between psychology and the legal system, and school psychologists sometimes do that, are myths about memory. And there are a whole host of different myths about memory, some of which are kind of dangerous, I think. That surveys show that upwards of 50% of the general public believes that human memory works like a video camera or a tape recorder, perfectly recollecting, perfectly recording all the events that occur to us. And that, I think, is not just a false belief, but it's really a potentially dangerous belief, because it may lead us to put uncritical belief in eyewitness reports, which, by the way, are not useless. Some psychologists go the other direction and say we shouldn't be looking at eyewitness reports at all. I don't go that far. I think they can be helpful in some circumstances, but we have to realize they can be fallible, and they can be subject to all kinds of suggestion and expectancy effects as well.
I know that I've read some of what you've written about just the MRI scans and studies with that, and I think that there's this general just the lack of understanding of the brain in the general public, and then even in people more specialized to the brain. I mean, the brain is, I tell people that I know just enough about the brain to know that I don't know nearly enough about the brain to even speak on the brain, and that I think that as a field as a whole, we really don't know. There's more that we don't know about the brain than what we do, and not to say that, some of these brain-based models have, are all total nonsense. But so what would be your cautions as far as, I see a lot of, this study shows that this area of the brain lights up, and this, brain chemical does this over here.
Yeah, again, I'm by no means anti-biology. I think we went through a period when I was in grad school, and hard to believe, it feels like the 1880s, but it was the 1980s now. So it feels like it's a different millennium. Well, I guess it was a different millennium, but it really feels like 1,000 years ago now. But I remember a period where our field was, at least my field of clinical psychology, was in some ways reflexively anti anything biological. I don't want us to see us go back to that era either. But we've increasingly entered an age of what my colleague Sally Satel and I call Neuro Centrism, where people seem to think the brain is sort of always the most important level of explanation for understanding every phenomenon. I don't believe that's the case. So in terms of brain scanning, I think one thing one has to realize, again, functional brain imaging is a remarkably useful technique, but what's strange to me is that in our Psych 100 classes, we all learn that correlation does not necessarily entail causation, and I sometimes find that when functional brain imaging studies are interpreted by the media, and sometimes occasionally even by psychologists themselves, you see this slippage from saying, oh, brain area X is activated during these conditions, to brain area X is causing these different phenomena. So people have to remember that these findings can be quite important, but they're merely descriptive. They're not telling us necessarily that brain activations are causing these phenomena. So in my own area of research, for example, I do a fair amount of work in psychopathic personality. People have consistently found that the amygdala tends to be underactive in response to fear-provoking stimuli in people who are psychopathic, and more relevant to school psychologists, perhaps, in some kids with conduct disorder, particularly those kids who have what are sometimes called high levels of callous unemotional traits. Those kids often also tend to show low amygdala activation. And those are pretty well replicated findings. I'm inclined to believe them, given what I've seen. But I've seen some researchers move on from those findings and say, oh, therefore, that means that this amygdala underactivation somehow causes psychopathic traits in these kids or adults. No, it doesn't necessarily. It may. But by the same token, it could just be it's reflecting other psychological processes. It could be causally downstream from those psychological processes by lack of fear. So the amygdala activation merely may be reflecting what we already know at a different level of explanation. We already know kids who are somewhat maybe pre-psychopathic, I would say, may have some traits that may predispose to psychopathy. Those kids often tend to have fear deficits. We also see that in the brain, not surprisingly, in the amygdala, and that's useful to know. But again, because of this tendency that's sometimes called Neuro Centrism, we may think the brain activation somehow comes first causally and must be giving rise to the psychological deficits. I don't agree with that. I think that's a serious logical error. I think the same thing holds more broadly for other brain imaging techniques. So they can be quite useful techniques descriptively. There's nothing wrong with looking at description. I mean, correlation is the bedrock in many cases of developing initial psychological hypotheses, but we have to be very careful not to then rush and assume causality.
Makes me wonder, what do you think about the diagnosis of ADHD and the sort of brain functioning deficit view of that brains with ADHD are not producing dopamine and serotonin at the same levels of other children, and that's what's happening?
Yeah, I would say I'm an expert in that area. My impression as a bit of an outsider is that there's probably some truth to that. I don't have any problem to be shocked if there weren't some differences between the brains of ADHD kids and non-ADHD kids. I'm sure there is. I suspect that what we call ADHD is not one illness, but it may be a heterogeneous set of different processes that give rise to outcomes that kind of all look somewhat similar to each other. So I'm not sure it's a monolithic condition. I also suspect, from what I've read, that ADHD seems to lie on a continuum, like many psychological disorders, probably most, so that where we draw the cutoff for it is probably a bit like where we draw the cutoff for blood pressure. It's probably going to be somewhat scientifically arbitrary. We can't make a useful cutoff for insurance reimbursement purposes or treatment purposes and so on, but I think we have to be careful not to then fall into the trap of thinking, therefore, there's some difference in kind, some qualitative difference between ADHD kids and non-ADHD kids. So, and I suspect that there are some ADHD kids, especially in rural communities, who are maybe not getting the treatment they need, and I think there are probably lots of other places where there are people who don't need stimulants and other treatments that are getting them unnecessarily. So in some ways, to me, the more crucial question is not so much our kids being misdiagnosed with ADHD, because I'm not sure, in my view, maybe a bit radical on this one, so people may disagree. I'm not sure it makes necessary sense to ask whether kids are being underdiagnosed or overdiagnosed with ADHD, because I think it probably is on a continuum, so where you draw the cutoff probably maybe a bit scientifically arbitrary, but maybe more meaningful to ask the question of which kids are actually being helped in terms of their attention and their school processing by stimulants and other medication, which kids aren't being helped. To me, that's maybe the more crucial question.
Yeah. I find that, of course, we know a lot of myths in psychology. I find that a lot of practices in education are especially questionable. And I think that's because we all, educators and administrators and school systems, like, we want to help kids. I think it's all very well intentioned. And so when something new and shiny and bright, catches our attention, we've got to do this totally new teaching strategy right now because we have to help these kids. That's kind of what we're going for. And it's frustrating to me how quickly, and I've only been, doing this for 10 years or so, how I see things kind of shift in and shift out and phase in and phase out. And it seems like we abandon practices as quickly as we get new practices. We're just kind of jumping around and not really seeing the overall effects, that we're having on these kids, and we're getting all these gaps, and just because, things are not consistent. I was in a training this year and they talked about, learning styles, and we're getting teachers to, we'll teach in their preferred learning style. Here's some surveys, here's some things. And I just sat there and was really frustrated. But at the same time, it's hard to, tell people that, hey, stop doing this. But I don't know, do you feel that education, because there is a political component to education as well, with funding and all that goes into education. Do you think that we're especially maybe subject to
Maybe.
these types of things, or?
Could be. I see it a lot in my own field of clinical psychology too. I don't know if it's worse in education or not, but I think it's definitely a problem in that field. I think partly the kinds of people who are drawn to education and clinical psychology, I think, are the kinds of people who want to help. I mean, that's why they're there. The people who do care and they have good intentions. They want to help, and that's I think a good motivation when we want, but it can also lead to this mistake of thinking the good intentions are enough. I think one thing we've learned, and I always tell my clinical psychology grad students, and I would argue the same thing for school psychology too, is I think all psychologists in training should do basic reading about the history of medicine. And I didn't do much of that either until about a decade ago or so, but I've gotten a bit more interested in that. And you see, if you read the history of medicine, just so many cases where lots of very, very smart people who thought they were helping were really harming terribly. So it's really important to understand that good intentions are not enough. And it's also important for people to realize that it's fallacious to assume that doing something is always better than doing nothing. I know that's a temptation. When something is wrong, we all want to rush in to try to help, but sometimes we may have to just wait. If there's not enough evidence yet, we may have to actually wait a bit, because we've come to realize that some educational interventions are actually potentially harmful. So, and harmful both in the sense that we may be investing a lot of time, energy, effort, money in things that don't work, but in some cases actually directly harmful. And I think of, for example, interventions for kids with cognitive disorder. We look at scared street interventions, which are still being used. There's some evidence that boot camp interventions fall in the same category, where meta-analysis suggests that these interventions may actually be harming a non-trivial proportion of adolescents. So, and look, I'm guilty of this too. When I was a psych intern, we referred a kid with really severe cognitive disorder to boot camp because we had this idea that, he was a kid who was very undisciplined. So we had this intuitively appealing idea that if he's undisciplined, therefore he's going to benefit better from discipline, right? Which seemed to make sense. But there's a good example of where intuitions can be wrong, because that isn't always the case. In fact, there's some suggestion that when you have kids who are undisciplined, why are they undisciplined? Because they're kind of ticked off and they're angry at authority, and imposing a boot camp intervention might actually make them worse. It might actually worsen their attitudes toward authority because they're tired of being told what to do. That's partly why they're acting out in the way they're acting out. So I think one other lesson that people have to realize is that intuitions are often faulty. I suspect if it is more common education than in other fields, some of it's because a lot of these things do seem to kind of be intuitive. We know our kids really well. We sort of see how they learn. We observe them all the time. So we might sometimes confuse our sense of familiarity with understanding. And that, I think, could be a pretty bad error.
That makes a lot of sense. Thinking about that education piece, I think a lot of, as Rachel said, well-intentioned effort goes into perhaps creating curricula as well, and certain approaches to reading in particular. Though I think of the one approach, language arts in education, that's gone through the gamut over the last 20, 30 years of approaches. And there's a psychologist up in Syracuse, New York, David Kilpatrick, who's doing a number of meta-analyses of reading programs and finding out that very little's been replicated other than the publisher's own work. And yet we spend millions, perhaps even more, on reading curricula, only to toss them aside in 5 years, 10 years, and jump on the next bandwagon.
Yeah, we'll look at all the buzz about whole word learning and things like
yes.
that. Yep. Before the data came out showing it often is not as good or efficient for most kids.
Right.
Maybe helpful later on to supplement basic phonics, but kids have to learn the basic phonemes first before they can move on to whole word learning approaches. But it made sense. I mean,
right.
Me too. I think I kind of bought into it, but I was mistaken. And I think you're right. I think we do jump onto fads all too quickly because we do want to help, and we've learned over and over again that we can get burned very badly. You mentioned Syracuse. Another example from that university was a technique called facilitated communication for autism.
Yes,
a big comeback in many quarters under many guises. I'll make many enemies by saying this, but I think that's a technique that's been pretty thoroughly debunked. And
Yeah.
it involves taking individuals with autism spectrum disorder, other disabilities who have severe linguistic deficits, some of whom are mute, and sitting in front of a keyboard with a facilitator who supposedly offers a little resistance to their hand movements, and supposedly kids who had IQs in the 20s and 30s can now type out remarkably eloquent sentences, paragraphs, and a few reported cases, even books, and would not want that to be true. And I lay, by the way, zero blame on the parents here, but that technique, which was popularized at Syracuse University in New York, still being used, is turned out to be quite disastrous in many ways, and really raised the hopes of tens of thousands of parents, I think, in quite cruel ways. But that gets people angry when I say that, and I understand that, because again, I think 99% of the people who use this technique are well-intentioned, but I would also argue that they're putting these kids at some risk, in the sense that they may actually be slowing down their ability to learn correct communication. We also know that they are putting their parents at risk, because we know that facilitated communication is associated with a large number of uncorroborated accusations of child sex abuse against parents. So there's a lot of risk with faddish techniques that have not yet been subjected to careful investigation. It doesn't mean, I think one thing that sometimes comes up, one criticism I sometimes get, we all get when we make these claims, is, oh, but is that really fair? Because shouldn't we be able to be creative in science? Shouldn't we be allowed to investigate new techniques? And I do think there's always that risk there. I agree with that, but I think one has to make a very clear delineation between investigating new techniques and trying them out experimentally, which I'm all in favor of, versus then distributing them on a mass scale for routine clinical practice. With facilitated communication, that was the error. It wasn't so much that people were trying it out and experimenting with it. I would have had no objection to that, but people were proclaiming that it was remarkably effective, and then training thousands, probably tens of thousands of teachers and others on how to do it before it was really ready for prime time.
Well, maybe that's one potential way to think about it. If we could develop better measurements of risk, what is the risk of trying this method, and be able to compare that? The risk of trying, Singapore math versus some other kind of math, it's probably smaller than the risk of misunderstanding a human being completely, So maybe if we were more careful about understanding the risks involved with certain newer approaches. What do you think about?
Great point. I think you folks know much about school psychology than I do, so I think I'd have to turn to you folks for the expertise in how to design those measures. But I very much agree, and I think that we don't think enough about risks. And there's actually been some good writing on this recently in the psychotherapy field. There, until recently, have not been good measures for tracking risk. So in many psychotherapy outcome studies, for example, we mostly measure benefits, and we should be measuring those things. But until fairly recently, there were few or no systematic measures for actually tracking harms, either in psychotherapy, like are people's levels of depression getting worse, or are people having more interpersonal conflict, are people having even things like, are people having more suicidal attempts, for example. In some prominent studies of psychotherapy outcome, some of those endpoints have never been assessed, so we may not always know whether some of these treatments are potentially harmful. So we have to be attending just as carefully to potential harms and risks as to potential benefits.
And I think that a lot of times in education, the people that are making the decisions on what new curriculum we're using, what new strategies we're using, what we're purchasing, as school psychologists, we don't really have a say in that. Sometimes it's like, okay, here you go. Here's what you're using. Teachers don't really have a say. It's up to kind of higher ups in the district that I don't even know what their background is. And so, it's a little bit scary sometimes.
I think part of the issue is in psychology, very few things are no cost. I think probably a lot of interventions probably produce a mix of both things. I think even psychotherapy, I think in general, the evidence is now pretty overwhelming. Psychotherapy does help in most cases, but most things in life consist of trade-offs, and we have to accept that. And so as we even see this when we treat people with depression, for example, or other disorders, sometimes as people begin to improve, they In some cases, it actually, in the short run, introduces more interpersonal conflict because people who they've been interacting with are kind of used to seeing them depressed, and now suddenly they're not depressed, and that often introduces some short-term conflict that wasn't there. Maybe it's healthy conflict, but sometimes we have to realize there are certain risks involved, actually, even in getting better in some cases, because it involves changes in people's interpersonal roles, for example. So I used to see this. I used to do a little bit of treatment with patients with obsessive compulsive disorder, and sometimes as patients got better, that sometimes produced more conflict with spouses or others, because spouses or others had to now begin to adjust to their new behaviors, which again, that's probably a good thing, but sometimes it did engender a bit more conflict that people then had to learn to deal with. You know?
For sure. Now, when we're looking at, do you have any recommendations for if we're reading a study or reading an article? What are some of the things that we should just be on the lookout that might be that we want to see in a study, or that would be red flags or something? What can you give us a drive-by on understanding research?
There are a lot of them. That's a tough one. There are many of them. It's a great question. I think one thing increasingly I would look for is have the people been clear up front about what the hypotheses were. And this is a particular issue when you have a study that has a lot of dependent measures, a lot of potential outcomes. There's sometimes a risk that people may have played with the outcomes after the fact to produce the results they want. So that I think is a particularly important thing for people to look for. And one thing I would encourage people to look for too, really this may be becoming more common in the next couple of years than it is now, but increasingly I would encourage people to make sure that the hypotheses were pre-registered. Not many people are doing that yet, but I think that's going to become more common in the next 5 or 10 years. I hope it will. So pre-registration is becoming, I think, a big trend in social psychology, cognitive psychology. I hope it becomes common in clinical psychology and school psychology too, where people are very clear up front about what their hypotheses were, what they weren't, so that they then can't, after the fact, then change their hypotheses or analytic plan. Because I think that's something we've come to realize is a big risk in many domains of psychology is people boring around with the data, having fun with them, looking at the data 100 different ways, and then after the fact claiming that they had generated those hypotheses up front. So there's nothing wrong with exploratory data analysis and looking around with your data in lots of different ways. The danger is doing that and then after the fact claiming that you predicted it. So that's, I think, is a very, very key thing for people to look for.
Can you give us a couple of thoughts on the replication crisis? What do you think is happening? Do you think that that there's the way that these studies are trying to be replicated is problematic, or do you think that it's more likely that the original studies were actually faulty?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about replication crisis. My first thought, by the way, is I think it's I think there is something of a crisis, but I also think we have to keep it in perspective. I think some media outlets have reacted to this crisis almost by implying that this means that psychology is broken or psychology is in shambles, that we can't trust anything in psychology. I think that's very unfortunate. I don't think that's at all the case. I mean, class conditioning is not going to go away tomorrow. Perceptual after effects aren't going to go away tomorrow. The fact that IQ tests predict achievement isn't going to go away tomorrow. There are thousands of psychological findings that are in fact extremely robust, and we have to realize that there's a little bit of a selection bias, or what epidemiologists would call a detection bias problem here. We're often focusing, as we should be, on the findings that we're not sure are right, trying to see whether they replicate, and sometimes they're replicating, sometimes they're not. So we have to realize that it doesn't mean all of psychology is in shambles. Now, with regard to the findings that aren't replicating, does that mean the original findings were wrong, the later findings were wrong? It's a mix of both. I don't know. I suspect it's a mix of both, and I suspect that we're seeing in a lot of these cases is that the initial findings may have been real, but the magnitudes may have been overestimated. So I think some of that may come from the fact that psychology journals are more likely to report and publish splashy positive findings. So when something comes out positive, it's more likely to be published than when something comes out negative. And you may end up with what statisticians call a winner's curse phenomenon, where findings are particularly likely to be a little inflated when they're first published. So I think what you see in those cases is what's been termed a decline effect, where the findings get kind of a bit smaller in magnitude later on. Again, it may be the original findings were just total flukes, or it could be that in a lot of these cases the findings were real, but they're much smaller than we originally thought. My own take on this is that we're seeing psychology reacting, I think, in a remarkably, by and large, mature way to this. I mean, there's been some overreach and some ad hominem attacks against scholars that I don't like, but that's been rare. I think in some ways psychology is doing exactly what a mature science should do, which is to try to self-correct. And I mentioned pre-registration a few minutes ago. That's a good example of how to try to self-correct and protect ourselves against the kinds of errors that we're all prone to. So I think out of the replication crisis, or whatever one wants to call it, I think will actually come an improved set of methodologies and increased awareness that we have to be more careful in guarding against our own confirmation biases, because what I think sometimes can happen is psychologists can be so sure they know the right answer, they can be so sure their hypothesis is correct, that they don't mind playing around with the data a couple of different ways so that it comes out the way they know is correct. Well, what they know is correct may not be correct.
It's interesting because in grad school, everything just seems so simple and like this is how it was, and then you kind of get out into it and it's like no, not really. So it's frustrating.
And it's like as Bismarck said about two things you don't want to see, right? Sausages being made and laws being pressed. It's sort of like how the sausage is being made, right? You don't want to. And that's sort of what it's like. Your textbook, it seems so neat and clean, but once you actually are on the ground floor, you see how the sausages are being made, and you realize it ain't so pretty. And you realize psychology, like any science, is messy. It's imperfect, and some of that's because it involves scientists have big egos too, and they're imperfect and they're flawed. And I think sometimes we don't make clear enough the case that what we're not talking about here is we're not talking about individual scientists, because individual scientists themselves are imperfect, infallible, myself included. What we're talking about here is the scientific community that has a bulwark, a whole set of protections, not perfect, but a whole set of protections to ensure that the odds that false findings will get into literature are minimized. Doesn't always mean that bad findings, false findings don't get disseminated. Sometimes they do. But eventually, I think there is a kind of, in most cases, we see a kind of self-correction going on in science that we often tend to not see in pseudosciences. Again, it's not perfect. Science doesn't always self-correct in the way we'd like or as quickly as we'd like, but we do generally see a kind of gradual self-correction in science that, unfortunately, we don't see as much in pseudosciences.
In terms of interventions and supports, do you have thoughts about research-based versus evidence-based, some sort of delineation between the two, and how those we could look at providing interventions? I'm thinking in terms of a lot of the sort of pop psychology sort of trends that come along, and how we might decipher a little bit between evidence-based and research-based. And
so I think there's a clear delineation between those two. I think that in clinical psychology, the distinction we tend to make is more between sort of evidence-based practice and non-evidence-based practice, where evidence-based practice involves the incorporation of the best available research along with things like clinical expertise and client preferences and values and so on. And I think again, we because we're human, we tend to like to dichotomize things, and sometimes we tend to think of some things as purely evidence-based, others not, and maybe that's okay for purely pragmatic reasons, but we have to realize it's kind of a fuzzy distinction, and there are a lot of things that we would say are evidence-based now that we'll probably realize in 5 or 10 years maybe not so much, and vice versa. But still, it's an important starting point. The only thing I would say, and this may not be a great answer to your question, Eric, but one thing I would say is I think my criticism, I think, of some of the evidence-based practice movement is that it may focus a little too exclusively on outcome evidence. I think outcome evidence about whether treatment works is very important, and we need to know that. But we also need, I think, to incorporate something about the plausibility of the theoretical rationale involved. So I think there are some treatments that may show positive outcomes just because of placebo effects or sort of other kinds of non-specific effects, but the theoretical mechanisms run so counter to everything we know that could possibly be scientific that it's very, very unlikely that they're actually working, or at least working in the way that we say they do. So I think of one example in my own field, fairly popular, or a group of techniques called energy therapies that some people claim can be used to treat anxiety and schizophrenia and depression and so on. And the proponents typically claim that the human body contains invisible, unmeasurable energy fields that somehow get blocked or perturbed, and that we can then unblock those fields by means of tapping algorithms on different bodily areas. Sometimes while the person taps, they sing a song at the same time, and so on. And again, these techniques, they may work better than nothing, and they probably do, because they do involve a little bit of exposure, which we know seems to work for anxiety, but it's very, very unlikely that they work for anything remotely like the reasons they supposedly say they do. So I don't want to imply, by the way, when I say that we need to have a well-delineated theoretical rationale before we use a technique. There are lots of things we do in psychology and even medicine that we don't know why they work yet. But when a technique has a theoretical rationale that runs dramatically counter to everything we know in science, we should at least be a little bit more skeptical of it. Again, maybe all of science will get overturned tomorrow. It's possible, but at least we should be a little more skeptical of those techniques and be a little more careful about making strong claims about them.
That's a great example. That is similar approaches are being utilized in schools with strong claims in terms of supporting social and emotional learning and self-regulation. So the tapping and while we know that there are benefits to meditation and mindfulness, some of the approaches may need to be questioned. So
yeah, and I was a bit skeptical about some of these mindfulness-based approaches. I'm coming around a little bit. I think it has some potential. I do worry a little bit about the overhyping of them and the overgeneralization of them again, prior to strong evidence. I think they will have some potential. I think they're going to have a role to play, particularly for some individuals. So I'm open to them. But again, let's be a little more modest in our expectations and also in our claims to clients, because I think as the outcome data are coming out from mindfulness-based approaches like compassion-based kind of behavioral therapy and so on, I think we're seeing they have some promise for depression and some other conditions, but the effect sizes are not maybe as dramatic as some of us might have hoped, and it doesn't look like they're panaceas and miracle cures either. So they may have some role to play, but it's unlikely they're going to quite live up to the hype that people expected. But we see that pattern a lot in our field, where there's a lot of hope and expectation. Sometimes the treatments live up to the hope and the hype. Sometimes they don't at all. And sometimes, like with mindfulness-based treatments, there's probably some truth to them, and they're going to prove to be helpful, but they're not going to be miracle cures.
Gotcha.
That makes sense.
So we're going to ask people for any last-minute questions or anything to submit that. But I wanted to, as we're wrapping up, and I don't know how familiar you are with some of these not being specific to the field of school psychology, but do you have any thoughts on things like, trauma-informed practices, the growth mindset, grit, executive functioning? These are all things that we're hearing a lot of that are kind of gaining more and more traction.
Yeah, I see some questions on that on the side. So yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that. I think, but on some of those I have some awareness of. I certainly familiar with the growth mindset work of Dweck and others. My impression is that I think it's a very interesting concept. I really like that concept quite a bit. My impression is there have been some replication problems with that work, and I don't quite know how robust those findings are going to turn out to be. We'll have to see. Again, I think that the idea behind them, the idea of inculcating this idea in kids and others that yes, you can change this ability, that these things aren't fixed, which I think I agree with Dweck and others. That can be a very dangerous view. This idea that somehow you can never change your intelligence or change X or Y, I think is a very problematic view. So the idea of inculcating a growth mindset, I think, is a good one. But I know there have been problems in replicating some of that work. Grit is another one. I think I know familiar with Angela Duckworth's work on that. And again, I think the idea is a tricky one. Again, my impression is the data have not really been borne out quite in the way people hoped, and even Duckworth has, or I think it's Melanie Duckworth. I may have getting the two Duckworths confused. I always get those two confused.
Oh, Angela, you're right.
Yeah, you're right.
I think two Duckworths. So it is Angela. Thanks. Even she has expressed some concerns, I think appropriately, about the premature application of grit into school context, which I'm pleased to see. I think it's also unclear. One problem we have in psychology sometimes is we have a tendency to reinvent new concepts for things that have been around for a long time. And it's not clear to me how different grit is from other well-established personality traits like conscientiousness. We know conscientiousness and persistence, we've known for decades that those are very good predictors of school performance, work-based performance, and so on. And those things are important. How different grit is from those older concepts, I'm not really entirely sure. So we'll have to see. Was there one other? I'm trying to think. You mentioned.
Let's see. Trauma informed, and then executive functioning.
Yeah, trauma informed. The only thing I can speak to is my own field of clinical psychology. I think that, and this will be controversial what I'm about to say, but I think that we have, on the one hand, I'm torn about this. On the one hand, I think in the past we sometimes underestimated the role of trauma, and I think there's no question that trauma can be an important risk factor for certain types of psychopathology, and we definitely need to attend to it carefully. On the other hand, I think we have sometimes seen some overreach in our field where we sometimes see almost a trauma-centric view of some forms of psychopathology, where there are some people, at least in clinical psychology, who sort of seem to think that trauma is sort of at the center of almost every major mental disorder. And my worry about that is we have sometimes overreacted by underestimating people's resilience. I think we've come to realize that trauma can clearly, particularly when it's very severe, like repeated early child sexual abuse, clearly can have detrimental impacts later on. On the other hand, we've also come to realize that following other kinds of traumas, like following 9/11, for example, I think we came to realize that we often underestimated the degree of trauma. Most Americans, myself included, by the way, I grew up in New York City, and if you'd asked me the day or two after 9/11, was I experiencing some PTSD symptoms? Yes, I was. I had trouble sleeping. I had some nightmares. I was angry. I was anxious, and so on. And many Americans had those symptoms for a day or two, a couple of days after 9/11. But if you went back a month later and people did, what you found is most people were able to bounce back. So we have to balance those two in a way that I'm not really sure I understand yet, where we have to recognize the role of trauma and be sure to ask about it. But we shouldn't, though, boomerang in the other direction by assuming that once people have been exposed to terrible trauma, that they're somehow doomed for life and are more or less predestined to never recover from that trauma pending psychotherapy or other kinds of dramatic kinds of interventions. I think that's very, very unfortunate. I think we've generally underestimated the degree of resilience people have, and I think we have to do a better job of recognizing when people need psychological help following trauma, when they don't, and to be able to give them appropriate resources when they are in need of some assistance.
That's great. Maybe just to wrap up the whole concept of our conversation, I'm wondering what you think about the popularity of pop psychology or psychological journalism, like maybe authors like Daniel Pink or Malcolm Gladwell. I feel like psychology is everywhere you turn in a bookstore lately. I wonder if you think that is valuable to our field in some way, or do you think that it does more damage than good?
Oh, I'm a big fan of that stuff in principle. Yeah, I know Pink a bit. I know Gladwell better. I saw Pink give a talk, actually. I think both great speakers. I met Gladwell once, and I've read some of his stuff. I liked some of his writing. Some of it's been valuable. So, in principle, I'm a really strong believer in what APA President George Miller once called giving psychology away. I don't think we do nearly enough of it. I think that's wonderful. I do think that there are some dangers, and I think you can kind of guess where I'm going on this one. I think the dangers are moving from simplifying psychological findings, which we need to do, to oversimplifying them a bit. So I think that some of these pop psych journalists, I think, have made some of those mistakes. Gladwell, I think, writing his book Blink, which by the way was by and large a good book, I think made some valid, valuable points. But in my own view, he may, in that book, have overestimated the value of intuition and rapid cognition, and underestimated the dangers of relying uncritically on our gut instincts. Now, in fairness to Gladwell, he did acknowledge those dangers in his book, but I wish he'd done a little bit more about that. So I think there's a real role for pop psychology journalism. I think it's gotten a bad name, which I think is unfortunate, but I think it's really, really crucial for not just pop psychology journalists to do this, but I also think it's important for those of us who are psychologists to get our word out directly. We are really oftentimes not encouraged, sometimes actively discouraged from doing that. I'm not saying we should replace pop psych journalists, but we should be doing that alongside of us, alongside of them, and we should be trying to popularize our psychological science along with them. We're beginning to see some psychologists do that, like Bob Sapolsky has done that, Dan Gilbert, Steve Pinker of all, Daniel Kahneman, all written wonderful books for the general public, where they've done a great job of bringing psychological science more to the general public. So I think we need to fill that gap just as much as pop psychologists and pop psychology journalists do as well.
Great. Awesome. All right. So we're going to wrap up then. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out from your day to do this. We really appreciate it.
A lot of fun.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.